Okay, welcome everyone to another meeting of the Online Peace Science Colloquium. I'm Chelsea Estancona. I'm one of the co-organizers alongside Brad Smith. I'm at University of South Carolina and he is at Vanderbilt University. The Online Peace Science Colloquium is designed to sort of broaden the participation and increase opportunities for others who would like to be involved in the Peace Science Society in an online format. And so this began in 2015, and we have been celebrating fantastic research that happened before and after the annual meeting, which was just last week, and sharing this with a broader online community. You can find additional resources about this colloquium on the Peace Science Society website. There is a tab that links to the online Peace Science Colloquium. So today we have a fantastic paper that is also available on that Peace Science Society website. It is titled, "Can International Interventions Build States? Evidence from the United Nations Development Program." And this is brought to us by Annamaria Prati, who is a PhD student at Washington University in St. Louis. And we have two fantastic discussants. We have Sabrina Karim from Cornell University and Cyrus Samii from New York University. So I will just remind the audience that you are welcome to leave comments or questions in the chat, and I will do my best to monitor those. If they make sense sort of in the flow of discussion, as our discussants are asking questions of Annamaria, I'll try to slide them in. Otherwise, we're going to prioritize comments from the discussant and then move to the audience's participation. So we'll have Annamaria present for 15 minutes, and then we will open up to our two discussants. So Annamaria, take it away. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chelsea. Let me set up my screen share. Okay. So thank you for Online Peace Science Colloquium for the opportunity to share my work today. And thank you to Professor Karim and Professor Samii for taking the time to read my paper and for your feedback. And thanks to everyone in the audience who's here to hear me present my paper, Can International Interventions Build States? Evidence from the United Nations Development Program. So in this project, I'm seeking to ask the research question, are international interventions successful at state building in failed and fragile states? Where state building refers to both the mitigation of violence as well as the building of institutions. Now, these are related concepts. The idea is that an international intervention will come and help build up a state's institutions, which should lead to an increase in that state's capacity. And together, this should lead to an observable decrease in violence in the state. So to preview my findings, I show that as exemplified by the United Nations Development Program, or UNDP, international interventions are associated with decreased violence in failed and fragile states. Now, this is not a new question in political science. It has been and currently is actively debated in the literature. And I say that the debate falls roughly into two camps. The first might be more familiar to a popular audience based on press coverage of some state building failures, such as Black Hawk Down in Somalia in the 1990s, or maybe more recently, Iraq and Afghanistan. So scholars in this camp agree that state building efforts usually fail, but might have different reasons for why. Some say that they fail by nature. We are injecting a third party into a potentially active conflict zone, which could alter the dynamics on the ground that might actually lead to increased levels of violence. We also are having a third party on the ground, so they might lack that legitimacy to build domestic institutions that will be readily accepted by local citizens. Maybe they don't fail by nature, but they might fail just because they're so often poorly implemented. We know that these can be very insular communities. They might have a more cookie cutter approach, but very different situations on the ground that it may not always be appropriate. And they are often very metric oriented, and these metrics may not actually incentivize meaningful substantive changes that could lead to successful state building. And finally, maybe they just have very limited to no impact. So they're not necessarily making things worse, but they're not making things better either. Now, the other side of this debate says that international interventions under the right circumstances can sometimes succeed. And they point to some recent successes, such as the UN peacekeeping operation in Liberia, shown here, where there was the first successful peaceful transfer of power in Liberia in 70 years. But these international interventions have to have some very specific characteristics, which includes adequate resources, both in terms of finances, but also personnel. They need to interact with civilians on the ground to help build that domestic legitimacy needed for institution building. And they need to work on really long time horizons so that they have the time and space to make these meaningful changes needed for a successful state building project. Now, based on these three criteria identified in the literature, I argue that UNDP is a crucial case for the international interventions debate. UNDP has the largest state building specific fund in the world. In 2020, it spent $1.3 billion just on state building projects. And these funds were spent across hundreds of projects around the world that at least theoretically offered the opportunity for UNDP personnel to interact with local citizens. And these projects work on very, very long time horizons. So they have the time to potentially make the meaningful changes needed in a society for successful state building. Now, UNDP has been studied before, usually as part of the United Nations more generally, but I found that a few case studies call out UNDP by name. And these previous qualitative case studies do not find UNDP to be an effective state building actor. They find that UNDP is very insular, that they are unresponsive to changing dynamics on the ground, or that they lack the necessary authority to be able to make the changes needed for successful state building. That being said, UNDP by itself has never been systematically studied. So it is possible that these are not representative cases. So to help better understand this important organization, as well as help arbitrate this debate on international interventions, I collected a new data set on UNDP state building projects. And given UNDP's strengths in these keys for success outlined by the literature, I believe that UNDP should have more work correlated with more success. Specifically, a broader intervention presence, as evidenced by having more projects, will be associated with decreased violence, and a deeper intervention presence, as evidenced by more expenditures, should also be associated with decreased violence. Now, to collect this new data set on UNDP state building projects, I wanted to focus on the most difficult cases. So the UNDP data starts in 2012. So I looked at the 2011 Fund for Peace Index on Failed and Fragile States and focused on the top quartile. I then further focused to just states in sub-Saharan Africa, and then I added South Sudan because that would not actually be eligible for the report in 2012. And this yields me a sample of 13 states. Now, to ensure that my geographic unit of analysis was consistent across the states, I then divided them into 1 degree by 1 degree grid cells. I then collected the UNDP state building projects, which included the project's location, geolocation, and each of the project's annual expenditures, which gives me 111 grid cells with at least one UNDP project. I then paired the UNDP data with geolocated data on violent events from the Armed Conflict Location and Event Dataset, or ACLED. And then I summed up the violent events with the UNDP data to the grid cell year level. Now, these UNDP projects are not randomly placed across sub-Saharan Africa. In fact, based on UNDP's own documentation, as well as empirically, it seems that UNDP targets locations that are historically more violent. So I leverage the fact that ACLED started collecting violent events data in 1997 in sub-Saharan Africa. So I matched these grid cells based on their historical patterns of violence, as well as some covariates, finding a match for all 111 treated grid cells. So as an example, here are two of my grid cells that are matched together. One's in Nigeria and one is in the Central African Republic. They are matched in terms of how far away they are from the capital and how much of the grid cell is included in the given country. They are not perfectly matched, but at least better matched in terms of the historical patterns of violence. So my treated grid cells are still historically more violent than my untreated grid cells. So for my results, I took my matched data set and I used OLS regression, and I find that having a project in a given grid cell in a year is associated with 0.4 fewer violent events in the following year. And I find that every additional $1 million in a grid cell in year is associated with 0.8 fewer violent events in a given year. In all of my models, I'm including a lagged measure of the dependent variable and grid fixed effects and year fixed effects. So it's a two-way fixed effects model. And then I clustered the standard errors at the country level. In the paper, I also include subsets of the violent events where it's just the actors by the state, or actors or non-state actors, and I find substantively similar results. Now, this is offering me support for both the breadth and depth hypotheses. So specifically, more state building projects is associated with fewer violent events, and larger state building expenditures is also associated with fewer violent events. Now, one potential caveat is that these effect sizes are arguably small. These are fairly large amounts of resources, maybe not on the scale of the war in Afghanistan, but if you consider the annual GDP of these places, these are still fairly large amounts of resources. And these are also fairly violent parts of the world that experience potentially dozens of violent events in a grid cell in a year. So while every violent event is the possibility of people being harmed or killed and loss of property, it's still very expensive to decrease it by a single violent event. So that's one caveat I would draw from my results. Now to conclude, I used a new data set on UNDP state building projects that I collected, where I sought to arbitrate the scholarly debate on whether international interventions can effectively build states. And I find that a greater breadth and depth of projects is associated with successful state building as measured by decreased levels of violence. Now, for future work that I think my project opens up, in this particular paper, I'm focusing just on UNDP in failed and fragile states in sub-Saharan Africa. So I think it could be interesting to see how UNDP might perform in other parts of sub-Saharan Africa or other regions in other parts of the world, or even how other organizations might fare within the same set of countries. I think I set the bar pretty high in this project by focusing on the failed and fragile states. But I could have set the bar even higher by using a broader definition of state building. So here I'm pretty minimalist with just the absence of violence. But I would be curious to see how UNDP might fare if I used a more maximalist definition. And finally, my data as it is and what is available through UNDP's website doesn't offer the granularity that I would need to be able to test whether it's the long time horizons, the interactions with civilians, or with the to be able to see what is actually leading to UNDP's success here. But I think I could maybe under a more controlled environment in a specific country, maybe try and design an experiment to test for that mechanism. So this being said, I think that despite the prominent press coverage on international state building failures, I think my results overall give hope that international interventions can effectively mitigate violence and build states. So with that, I conclude my more prepared remarks. For my feedback for today, I have some, I guess, like questions on what might be available for my expanded definitions of state building that might be appropriate and available in a failed and fragile state and cross-national environment. One of the challenges of this project is that covariates that are reliable and consistent and time varying for this part of the world seem to be pretty few and far between. But if somebody has thoughts on other avenues I could try and explore, so I'm maybe looking more at institutions or something broader than just the absence of violence, I'd be all ears for that. And the other concern that I have is that, yes, I'm focusing on this top quartile from the Fund for Peace for failed and fragile states, but there's still a fair amount of variety in the states that are included. So the reasons that Kenya or Zimbabwe might be included in the sample might be very different than the reasons for why South Sudan or Somalia might be included on that. And so the Fund for Peace's index is advantageous in that it's not just considering violence, it's considering a broad variety of indicators. But I'm relying pretty heavily on these fixed effects to be able to control for these differences in the cases. But if there are other ways that that might be more convincing to the scholarly audience, I'd also be interested to hear any of those comments. And of course, if you have other ideas, I'm all ears for those as well. Those are just two top of mind, very prominent things that I'd like to know more about. So with that, thank you. And I look forward to your comments.
Okay, thank you so much, Annamaria. That was fantastic and like right on time. So you did splendidly with that. So we'll turn to our discussants and we'll have Sabrina give her thoughts first.
Yeah, so thank you, Annamaria, for the opportunity to read this paper. I think there are, a lot of really great things happening. So I think, a study on the UNDP has been needed for a long time. And so I'm really glad that you're, collecting this data and looking specifically at that particular UN organization. I think that's going to be a really good contribution. And yeah, so my comments are really kind of thinking about the best way to think about what the UNDP represents as well. So like broad framing and then going into that's going to get into like maybe a little bit about the case selection and theory, and then maybe a little bit about the empirics. So in reading the first half of the paper, there were all kinds of concepts floating around. So everything from interventions to state building to aid to, and so it wasn't clear to me from the onset that UNDPK or UNDP is an example of an international intervention. It's like, how are we defining intervention, and like, why is UNDP programs in intervention as opposed to like foreign aid? And this is like the biggest like thought that I have in terms of concepts. Like, really, when I think of UNDP, I think of it as a foreign aid program that's like by the UN as opposed to by any one country. And so is this not just an example of, you know, the looking at a different aid organization and the effectiveness of reducing or exacerbating violence? Like, there's a whole literature, right, on aid and violence. So that's where I thought this would have been situated, is that. So it wasn't clear to me how it's a state building paper necessarily. So I'm not convinced about that framing. Maybe Cyrus will disagree with me there, but I think it feels to me like a little bit of a stretch, especially because the outcome that you're looking at is violence. And while violence and state building are interrelated, they're not the same thing. And so I think I would just name the outcome, right? It's violence, right? You're looking at to me, you're looking at the effect of a particular type of aid on reducing violence. So that's kind of where that's how I would narrow the focus a little bit, I think. So that brings me to like, well, so how is UNDP aid different from other forms of aid? And I was a little confused about the coding, because there's one sentence where you said that you were just coding peace and justice institution aid as opposed to like all UNDP aid. So that was just a question of like why you did that. And maybe because I think you were trying to look at like things that are more related to state building, but to me it would make sense to probably code all of it and look at that. But are you picking up through this data collection just places that are receiving more aid generally from everyone and from everywhere, from other countries? So I would want to see some kind, you know, like aid data is out there. So like kind of comparison of like, is UNDP aid going to places where other aid is not? Like, how is it different from the other aid? And so like, are you just picking up on like a whole bunch of money and resources and time being spent into these like quadriles or like, you know, whatever the units of analysis are, or is it something specific about UNDP? Like that's not clear. And even in the theoretical part, like I think you want to distinguish UNDP from other kinds of aid in terms of the long time horizons and like the other things that you mentioned, right? I think that that's a really interesting innovation, and I'd like to kind of see that fleshed out a little bit more, but in comparison to other kinds of aid. I was kind of surprised that you didn't have peacekeeping missions in there as a part of the matching in the grid cells. So like, again, you know, you have few countries that have peacekeeping missions in this time period in the sample itself, but like, just like, again, are you picking up on that as well? And then in terms of case selection, like I understand that you're trying to get at the hard cases, but I would have started with like all sub-Saharan African cases first, and then use this subset as like a hard test. So I think it would, because, you know, ACLID captures not just like severe civil conflicts, but like all kinds of political violence. I think you'd have like a reason to be able to include all cases in sub-Saharan Africa to start out with. Yeah, so yeah, I mean, especially because like some cases that I would have expected, and even the qualitative cases that you mentioned, like Burundi and Liberia, are not in your sample, right? So just curious about that. And just as like, you know, as we're thinking about non-randomness, I would be curious about what predicts UNDP projects in the first place. Like, it's just as like a first order question, like where are we seeing, like you said, they're more prone to go to severe conflict areas, but like I kind of want to see that. And like I didn't see the citations for that either. So like empirically, I'd want to see like the selection as just kind of a first cut. I also, if you do want to go the state building route, so like maybe this is like paper number 1 in terms of like, okay, does UNDP as a specific type of aid reduce conflict? That's like paper 1. Paper 2, you know, if we're thinking about like state building outcomes, you know, you might think about like Afrobarometer or DHS data, aggregating DHS data. So there's a lot of great work by people at PRIO that have aggregated the DHS data in terms of like thinking about other kinds of outcomes. And then like, I think, looking at legitimacy through Afrobarometer might also be like other possibilities in terms of outcomes as you're thinking of like moving away from violence and like more like positive peace kind of aspects. Last thing I'll just say is I was just curious about if there were any like, this gets at the selection of UNDP, but like COVID effects. Like, did we see changes in what UNDP does with projects during the COVID years? So maybe just like take those out. And right, you have 2020 and 2021 in there, 2020, I think. So anyways.
Just 2020 for UNDP,
Yeah, I mean, maybe
so that I could lag 2021 violence.
Yeah. I'll leave it there. I might have other things to say, but I'll let Cyrus comment.
Awesome. Thank you, Sabrina. Okay, go ahead, Cyrus.
All right. So the project right now is taking a very high, like, bird's eye view of the question, and so it's like pulling the data, from the UNDP website, pulling the ACLED data, sort of putting it together with, a few covariates you're able to have, and sort of like checking some patterns and stuff like that. And so, like, for me, at least, I think for the research to be more convincing, we have to get a lot closer to the ground to see what might be going on, So I feel like a productive next step might be to consider doing a single country case study where you could get much better and more comprehensive data and just a much clearer picture as to what's going on. So I was just looking, for example, at the UNDP website for South Sudan. And there's a lot of programming going on, but it's like, it's a real mixed bag, and like linking some of the programming to, dynamics that might affect violence. Like, I mean, in some cases it's clear, in some cases it's not, right? Even if you look at like programs that come under SDG 16, I mean, in some cases, so there's like there's some programs that are explicitly intended to apparently target violence, but if you look more closely at what's going on, like they have some support for rule of law institutions where the aim seems primarily to offer ways for marginalized groups and women to be able to access justice with like gender-based violence and things like that. And so like we're starting to move like very far away from the kinds of non-state, much less state level violence that ACLED is picking up on, unless you're talking about situations where there are like mass atrocities taking place. But it's not clear to me that these interventions are necessarily aimed at that. So I feel like getting into a case and cataloging in more detail what's going on with these programs would be really helpful, so we can start to think about, okay, in what ways, might these programs be affecting violence, and what kinds of violence. That has implications for the research design too, right? So like, if we're talking about, develop like programming that is contributing to some combination of development and maybe also security sector, capacity building or something like that, that might affect like insurgent violence, then it would seem that like those dynamics would be happening at like a regional level, right? Because the manner in which insurgent violence is organized, is not happening at a very fine grain level, but this would be something that would be affecting more like higher level strategic dynamics. And so I would think that the analysis should be structured in a way that is like corresponds to the level at which violence is being organized. So you know, you have the grid cells and everything like that, and that's a way of kind of like assembling the data. But then, you know, in terms of defining what a treated area is, it's not clear to me that a grid cell per se is what should be treated, as opposed to like a collection of grid cells within some, you know, regional strategic theater or something like that. So I feel like, you know, understanding more about what the programs are, what kind of violence might be affected, will help in sort of defining the right level of analysis and the sort of like units that we want to be working with. Along similar lines, I didn't know what to make of the effect on state violence. You mentioned in the paper itself that like states essentially invite UNDP in. I think in some cases it's a little more complicated than that. Like in a place like South Sudan, I don't know how much discretion the government has there, given its level of aid dependency. Nevertheless, in some of the countries in which you're working, I do think that there's like a high degree of selectivity. And so insofar as the state is inviting UNDP to be there, I'm not, it's not clear to me what the mechanism would be through which like a UNDP project, you know, being set up somewhere would have a causal effect on state level violence. It might be sort of an indicator of what's going on more generally in that area. And, you know, UNDP projects being there are just sort of like, you know, part of like maybe a situation where things are stabilizing or something like that. But it's not really like a causal effect of the presence of the UNDP program. Let's see. Along those lines, a lot of UNDP programming seems to operate in cooperation with like line ministries or local government agencies. I was also looking up some of the UNDP projects in like Eastern Congo, for example. The ones under SDG 16 seem, some of them at least, the ones I was looking at, were like basically support to local government, and like paying for like vehicles for you know, like local representatives and stuff like that. So then you know, it's like, okay, these are investments, but they're also investments that are kind of like complemented by investments by other agencies as well. So it's like, what is UNDP's like contribution here? How do we even think about, you know, this as an like as an intervention per se? I mean, yeah, it's sort of like, I guess in this case it is kind of a state building sort of thing insofar as you're like paying for the vehicle for a government representative. But it's like, I think having those sort of details is helpful for getting a sense of what might be going on. And that like connects again to this broader point that I don't think these UNDP interventions are usually happening in isolation. They're probably happening alongside other things that might be going on. There might be peacekeeping, there might be policing activities going on. I know that UNDP is kind of like an organization that does a little bit of everything. So it's like in some places UNDP is responsible for like ex-combatant demobilization, and other places it's the World Bank that does that. Some places UNDP is just doing like education and health, and like DPKI is like, it's this very mixed sort of thing. And so like being able to distinguish the UNDP effect from like general aid effect and like, you know, DPKO effect and stuff like that is probably sort of hard. So then I'm even wondering, okay, maybe we want to think about like a single country case study where we actually look at a specific UNDP program or a specific set of UNDP programs where we really like understand what we're talking about here, and account for like, you know, the potentially confounding variation in the presence of like troops and everything like that, and really like, you know, like get more specific in those terms. Like maybe that's the way to go, you know what I mean, in order to try and isolate a UNDP effect per se.
Okay, these are fantastic comments. So Annamaria, I'm going to give you a chance to respond to both Sabrina and Cyrus, and certainly follow up, ask additional questions on what they've said if you have them. And just a reminder to our audience, I am looking at the Q&A, so if you have something you want to throw in there, please feel free.
Thanks. And thanks for these really great comments. So I think one theme that you both touched on was like what exactly is the treatment here and how homogeneous or not these treatments might be. So this is something that I struggled with a little bit, which is where I ended up on landing on the SDG 16, as opposed to including the other things that UNDP might do. UNDP's SDG 16 expenditures is like 25%-ish, plus or minus in a given year of their given budget. So I think that the other 75% is very solidly in foreign aid territory, with more like support to immunizations, like in coordination with UNICEF, or support to education. I thought that maybe the things that this SDG 16 was doing seems qualitatively to be systematically different than that kind of work. There's a lot of workshops, a lot of trainings, a lot of more like high level like institutional support, and also buying vehicles or paying for computer systems and things like that. So like I think that the idea of like setting up processes or trying to set up better standards or trainings is just different than maybe buying textbooks or paying for immunizations. So the difference between those two is why I was trying to say that SDG 16 is different than this other 75% that UNDP does, and it's not foreign aid as clearly anymore. Now, whether within SDG 16, the treatment effect is still homogeneous, I think is potentially debatable. It's definitely clear that in certain countries, SDG 16 falls like very solidly, like they're all doing the similar kinds of work. So like Zimbabwe comes to mind, that all of the countries are kind of pulling in the same direction. But in other countries, such as South Sudan, they seem to be the Democratic Republic of Congo is another one. They're definitely much more of a mixed bag. So maybe a step forward for that would be to look at more carefully what exactly these projects are looking to do, to make sure that the actual objective based on the UNDP documents falls into that state building as opposed to foreign aid, and then also to make sure that they're all more homogeneous in terms of what it is they're aiming for. I see that Sabrina has a question. Was this like on that point? Because I was going to
Cyrus, you want to go first?
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just to clarify, so I mean, like, there's no expectation that like a common intervention would have the same effect in lots of different places. I mean, we assume actually that like things can vary on the basis of context. I think it's more a question, at least like from my perspective, I think Sabrina was saying something very similar, that like, you know, what are we talking about? It's a very mixed bag of things, you know. And so there are lots of dimensions of variation that make it hard to just kind of like interpret what like this UNDP coefficient is, or, you know, the breadth and depth coefficients are capturing. So, you know, some way, like giving us like a better sense of like, okay, like this, like there's this bundle of activities, you know, I mean, conceptualizing it, maybe there's a way to pull it all together, to conceptualize it as like as a bundle that we can understand as a treatment, as opposed to something that's like very specifically adapted to each location. So it's like in Eastern Congo, it's buying vehicles. In Nigeria, it's like holding workshops. In Sudan, it's like, you know what I mean? It's like, if it's heterogeneity like that, it's like, what exactly are we talking about? So that's kind of what I was getting at.
Yeah, and I would just add that I think the assumption that you're making that there's like a qualitative difference between SDG and the other kinds is maybe an empirical question. Like, what if you were to find that like you have the same effects if you include everything, and there's just like maybe it's like a branding thing, right? If something says UNDP, like that's the effect, not like the actually, I don't know. I'm just like, maybe that's what the treatment stands for or means. But I think it's an empirical question more than like something that you can kind of make assumptions about. So I would recommend like coding it all. If you're gonna like go with the cross-national like thing, like maybe not make assumptions and test it all, but then like do what Cyrus is saying is like, okay, like here's the broad sweep, but then like let's hone in on like South Sudan and like this is what the treatment means in this case, and then like do a more fine-grained analysis. Maybe do it for multiple countries, especially if we think that the treatment is going to be different. But you'll have a sense of like what the treatment should be from being able like doing the larger kind of sweep, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay. That makes more sense. In terms of the seeing like what other outcomes there might be, and like how related I think these projects should actually be to decreasing violence. I wholeheartedly agree that I think a decrease in violence is a downstream effect of what I think these projects should have, and how downstream actually might vary depending on what that treatment is, which is in part why I was hoping to maybe, and this would be a good place to do in a specific country or a case study, is to see if I could think of indicators or have data that's maybe only available for a specific area, things that might be closer to the actual theorized like downstream effects of these projects. The reason I fell on this negative peace metric was just because it was something that was systematically available and time varying and relatively high quality. But I do agree that because of the focus on the negative peace, it starts to border less maybe into the state building territory and more into the peace building territory. It starts maybe looking more like a peacekeeping paper without being peacekeeping. So I guess my question to both of you would be, if I were to include these case studies that had metrics that weren't just violence anymore, but maybe things that were closer to what I actually think those projects are actually trying to aim at, would that help situate it to be more solidly a state building paper while still making that cross-national analysis of these projects a relevant contribution? Because I do think the fact that this is UNDP in multiple states over time is one of the things that makes the project unique.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you could trace like a causal pathway, like just draw it out, it's like there are different channels through which like investments of the variety that UNDP make could ultimately like reduce levels of violence. And so maybe it's about like increasing policing capacity, right? Maybe it's about some development related pathway, right? Maybe it's just like increasing, maybe other, aid agencies come and follow UNDP's lead. So it's about like, there being effectively some like third-party monitoring showing up. Like there are these different mechanisms that one could imagine that could then translate into lower violence. And then insofar as you could track, effects on those intermediate outcomes, it helps us, to understand how this might be happening. Again, it might be hard to do this at the cross-national level like you're doing now. So maybe if you could pick a country where you think there's reasonable variation and decent data, that would be something you could work into the paper.
So I have a question for you, Annamaria. You seem like you are really wedded to this idea of state building as like the, like the outcome. and it's kind of a loaded term, right, in terms of like what the concept means and like how you measure it, and like, you know, so like are you wedded to like having a outcome slash dissertation slash, you know, multiple papers on like how UNDP affects state building, or like are you ultimately interested in like UNDP reducing violence? And I would agree with Cyrus. I think that there's maybe much more of a case and like more clear mechanisms for like reduced insurgent violence rather than like state violence. But so just like, can I just ask you that question?
So I like this idea that UNDP is trying to promote like the very specific kind of projects of incorporating governance institutions where they include like marginalized groups. So like ethnic minorities, women, religious minorities. And that to me falls more under the state building branch as opposed to the peace building branch. I know they're related, but the actual institutional like effects of having more marginalized groups as part of the governance process. Systematic data on the inclusion of minorities and women at the local level is a wall that I was hitting. So that's where I was pivoting to the violence. I'm in active search to see if maybe I can find more information about those, like who's actually in local government, and are these just paper institutions, or do they have real effects? Is I guess where my real interest was lying, hence the like resistance to moving to more peace building.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think then, I mean, if that's the interest, then like doing what Cyrus is suggesting, like focusing on one country is definitely the way to go. If that's the ultimate outcome that you're interested in. Yeah.
One other question that you had was what's like the UNDP project selection process? Like how do they determine where to put projects? So there's definitely empirically a pattern of past violence predicting where current like UNDP projects will go, but current violence does not have that same violence in previous years. This could be because UNDP needs to plan their projects usually 4 to 6 years in advance, which also gets at your idea for UNDP and COVID. They don't pivot that quickly. So UNDP didn't change operations that much in 2020, but they did starting in 2021, which was pretty rapid for UNDP.
Sorry,
other
Cyrus,
thing that
could be exploited. I mean, I know there's all kinds of questions about whether COVID is a natural experiment in any ways, but and probably not in this case. But anyway, that was just a thought.
I mean, it was such a actually, in some of these countries, it wasn't such a dramatic shock. It was more of a temporary pause. So, in a way, maybe because I think it was more of a shock to operations of international organizations like UNDP than it was to like local dynamics and all of these settings. So, that actually could work precisely for this reason.
You might look into it, right? Like if you expand the time horizon or like the time period a little bit more, if there was like a freeze on you know, in some countries and not others, or like whatever, like that might be something to look into.
Yeah.
Before I forget, just one totally unrelated thing. So in the countries where there's peacekeeping missions, one thing to just think about is that UNDP often like is like the continuation after the peacekeeping mission leaves. So they take up a number of the same kinds of projects that the peacekeeping mission was working on. Just like as another mechanism. I just wanted to say that while I'm thinking about it.
No, that's definitely true, and that's done by design. So the other thing that really predicts where UNDP projects will be is the proximity to the capital city or proximity to like major roads or transportation availability. So like even if it's a small airport, if there's a local airport, you're more likely to have a UNDP project there. I have not systematically tested it, but I did notice that they tend to be really clustered around capital cities. Hence the check that I did of just omitting the capital city grids. I dropped some of the projects. And the most of my understanding from that is from just asking UNDP personnel who are in charge of like implementing these projects and the country program offices, like how do they understand this working out? So like, yeah, access to infrastructure was a big one because UNDP usually does not build infrastructure.
So I just want to point us to two questions in the Q&A while we're sort of in the last couple of minutes here. So both of these come from Sky, who says first that they were thinking a little bit about potential temporal effects. Y'all can hopefully see these as well, but I'll read them for the audience. And reverse causality over time, which relates to your research design and treatment effects. So for example, if the UNDP deploys in time 1 and the project does reduce violence in the next couple of months, that may then determine, future UNDP projects at time 10, 20, et cetera. So the curiosity here is how do you deal with these potential reverse temporal effects? And also what is the temporal unit of analysis? So that is point 1. And then point 2 was if I wonder if you could use COVID and the likely pause in UNDP operations to see what happens when these projects no longer deploy to grids that they were previously deploying to. So kind of building off of what Sabrina and Cyrus were saying about the whether or not we can sort of look at this as a natural experiment or as an actual shock, but still maybe exploiting that variation.
Thanks, Sky. So I'll ask UNDP personnel like how that might look within, and if so, how would I be able to tell based on the data? The expenditures are at the annual level, so if they only froze for like a few months, I may not be able to tell. But I'll definitely follow up because that's an interesting idea. The temporal unit of analysis is years because of that expenditures being is annualized for a given project. As in terms of, so where these projects are is very sticky. So it's very rare for a project to start in a good cell and then have absolutely nothing going forward. So I didn't have the power to see what happens if I have a project or if it comes in and out of treatment. It's too small. It was like only 10 grid cells. So I couldn't tell based on just having the few years of data that I have, whether or not that has an effect. But stay tuned because as UNDP keeps publishing their data, maybe you'll get more of these because I think that's definitely something worth following up on.
So Annamaria, I want to give you plenty of time to sort of conclude or wrap up, but I'll take my privilege as chair and say just a couple of things. I also enjoyed reading your paper, and I am certainly not an expert in this literature, so please feel free to take everything I say with a grain of salt. And also, I think your two discussants already really sort of said what I'm going to say, but maybe it'll just encourage you to think about these things. I also was a little bit confused about if this is a state building paper. And specifically, I guess I would have expected to see more literature in the build up to the discussion of UNDP in particular, just about the relationship between state building and violence. I think we have a really, I mean, that's more than just a literature, right? That's like 3 literatures. So under what conditions should we generally expect that different forms of state building provoke positive peace, right? And again, that's a huge question, but I think if you're going to go this direction, even in like a dissertation or a broader project, I'd really like to see it conceptualized in that way, and to see how UNDP in particular more aligns with the principles of state building than perhaps other forms of intervention. I think that's maybe lacking a little bit right now in the theory. I had a similar question to Sabrina about like how these missions get allocated, specifically about decisions to allocate peacekeeping versus UNDP. I know that is probably not, again, this is not my area, but that's like unlikely to be coming from sort of the same person or the same centralized office. At the same time, I think it does provoke some questions about just when does the UN see either of these tools as being more appropriate? And I think that would help to back up a step and think just a little bit about how these decisions are made, and what the selection process looks like. And then finally, the last thing, I was thrilled that in your post presentation little spiel, the first thing you said was, I'm thinking about other kind of indicators of violence, because I had the same thought here that I think you have this little component of like, oh, we don't want to oversell, right? This is really costly for a very small reduction in violence. But we know that this isn't just about reducing violence. This isn't just about changing, the number of attacks or whatever. And so I think doing a really deep dive into the positive peace literature to see what indicators other authors are using there, and then seeing what you can leverage. I'm sure you might have already done this, but changes in corruption. I was thinking about changes in kind of localized economies that are usually driven by conflict, which may not be constant, but you may be able to sort of have some variation even in your cases. Certainly you mentioned like specific groups. I think violence against women is usually a good, like reductions in violence against women is usually a good indicator here. Again, your 2 discussants know so much more about this than I do, but I do think that you're on the right track instead of saying this is a large amount of money to reduce violence, maybe being able to tell us a little more about how the broader violent landscape is changed. But I'll stop there, and fantastic work. So you now have the floor to briefly wrap us up, and then I'll direct people to resources if they'd like to see this in the future.
Thank you. And thank you so much to everyone for these great comments. I think my most immediate step forward is to look at what my possible case study could be, and pair that more specifically with maybe a more state building specific metric that might be available just for a specific area or for a specific country. Because I think that that could help clarify what it is exactly UNDP is doing where, and then also maybe tie it more specifically to state building itself, as opposed to foreign aid or peace building. So I think that could be a really fruitful way forward. So thank you for that idea. And I'll also look at what impact COVID might have had, to see if there's anything that I can leverage there. The other, and I think third thing that I'm getting from this discussion is that we all know UNDP is in the mix of the many actors in the field in these areas, but maybe we still don't have a great idea of what it is that UNDP does and why UNDP is important and maybe different than its national counterparts like USAID or DFID. And so it might be helpful also to, either in this paper or in a different paper, try and take a step back and actually say, like, who is UNDP? What do they do? How are they same? How are they different? To help clarify, like, who are these people and why are they important? So
just
thank
really
you.
quickly on that point, I think it would be really important to demonstrate, like, if UNDP is acting alone in places or like with other actors, like in those grid cells or however you like decide to go forward with that. And also, like, in terms of experimentally, like you might want to think about UNDP as a brand, as opposed to like, maybe there's like something special about the UN versus like the USAID or DFID. So like some kind of like experiment around the branding might be really interesting, right?
Yeah, that's a good idea. I need to think about it more, but I do think that is part of it, is having the big UNDP sign. I think must be a big part of this. At least that's what I think off the top of my head in my office in St. Louis. So with that, thank you, and I'll give the mic back to Chelsea.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much, Annamaria, for bringing us this really great paper. Thank you, Sabrina and Cyrus, for very thorough, helpful discussion comments. Everyone, you can find this manuscript on the Peace Science Society website. It is under the Colloquia tab. You can also go back and watch this video from the beginning if you have missed the presentation at the outset. And if anyone does have comments or questions, feel free to comment on the YouTube page, or you can email the authors of this paper, and that information can all be, again, found on the Peace Science Society website. So I'll draw us to a close here. Thank you all so much for participating, and I hope everybody has a great weekend.